Our discussion of chapter 21, painting and other two-dimensional art, has to begin with the idea of Gothic versus Renaissance. So Gentile da Fabriano's Adoration of the Magi altarpiece is actually a wonderful example of the Gothic or medieval style still alive in the Quattrocento. And often the choice of style, that is the manner in which it's painted or created, is up to both the artist and the patron. So if Gentile becomes known for this style, a patron who prefers it might go to him specifically. Also, artists like Gentile might be very versatile and be able to do both a Gothic and a more classical humanist Renaissance style, depending upon the patron's likes and dislikes. So think back to chapter 20 and the Book of Hours of the Duke of Berry, where we have such a strong connection with the medieval, not only through style, but through material. The Book of Hours was created by the Limbourg brothers by hand, so it is a manuscript by definition. So there were pieces of vellum, which is calf skin, prepared and cut into pages that the artists drew, diagrammed out their composition, and then filled in with pigment, most often tempera. So it's quite a connection here that we have, not only between materials where we have also tempera on wood, but also the style of the depth here that is not quite the linear perspective we saw from Ghiberti and Brunelleschi, not quite even what we've seen from other northern artists like Dirk Boots, where it's quite a crowded composition there on the left with the Adoration of the Magi. This is a part of the Christmas story, where the three wise men come from the east to greet and give gifts to the Holy Family, that is Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus that you see there on the bottom left. It's the idea of giving the viewer something to pore over. And so our focal point here, of course, is the Holy Family and the crowds of people, including the Magi, stretch around behind the rocks and on back up the road into the distance, the way that we kind of go from our sowing, planting surf, and in this leisurely way back to the promenade outside the Louvre, kind of pour over the details of the Limbourg brothers composition as well. To do so, the act of viewing is often thought of as an act of devotion in and of itself. So it's quite an appropriate way of doing things, not only for a Book of Hours that was meant to sort of manage personal prayer throughout the day, but also for an altarpiece, which, whether it's public or private, is meant to again set the mood, set the tone for worship. Another altarpiece we might take into consideration is the Annunciation by Simone Martini and Lippo Memmi from the previous century, the Trecento. It's a great example of what I was talking about, where Simone Martini is known as an international style artist. While he is Italian, while he is influenced in many ways by humanism and the Greco-Roman world, he knows how to give a French patron, in this instance, the Gothic medieval gold covered style that such a bishop or cardinal would want. So we find little moments of Gothicness, not only in the frame here, which has been restored, where we have pointed arches and the lovely tracery that we can relate to the quatrefoils of the Florence baptistry, but also the style of Mary herself, a very graceful and a little bit, as you can see there, a little bit coquettish, a woman there receiving the news from the angel Gabriel. So everything from the richness of material to the elegance of the figures, where there's a little bit of that contrivance that's not quite as naturalistic, that is the medieval style holding on in the Tre and Quattrocentos. But we can also see Gentile's work here up beside Masaccio's as something that is not fully medieval. Take, for instance, the arches that are no longer pointed, but are nice, rounded Greco-Roman arches that Brunelleschi would be proud of. Also, the idea of directing the viewer the way that Gentile does in kind of a zigzag quality. Remember, we saw a very centralized, rational means of doing that. So the two aren't complete opposites in that they're disconnected, the Gothic and the Renaissance. They have the same goals: to direct the viewer's focal point, to essentially teach matters of theology and scripture in a visual manner. So as we move forward, it's great to know how patron and artist and the region itself, Italy or France, for example, place into the manner, the style in which the ultimate artwork is created. And just as a reminder here, Masaccio is also a great example of the linear perspective that Brunelleschi is credited for, with the way that the coffered, oops, my pen doesn't want to work. There we go. The way that the coffered lines of the vault all converge down onto a very specific vanishing point at the foot of the cross, making it a very strange point of view perspective for us, because this is a fresco up on a wall, but emphasizing both the naturalism of the scene, as if we could climb up into the very crucifixion scene we're looking at, but also setting it apart as something that is definitely more in a spiritual space rather than real earthly mundane space. So Masaccio's work is like the famous Trecento artist Giotto, which you can read about in chapter 19, is done for a very particular family, the Brancacci. Giotto was working for the Scrovegni in Padua, and the Brancacci are one of those Florentine families, not so powerful perhaps as the Medici, not such a big place in history, but like the Medici, they were interested in good works, civic donations, as it were, including their own family chapel. So this is in part a very private piece for the Brancacci alone, and yet it serves a very spiritual piece of Renaissance goals here, where many of these families are bankers, remember, and the Bible in very specific spots doesn't look kindly on moneylenders and bankers. It's definitely not the most wholesome of occupation. So these families would definitely be interested in securing their salvation, securing their places in heaven. They really did think quite that specifically by creating these chapels, by donating to particular orders of monks and nuns to pray for them after their deaths, to ensure that they get out of purgatory and into heaven. So Masaccio is part of that process of securing heaven in a way as the artist of these frescoes that he would complete, not alone, but just like Giotto, with his apprentices at his side to paint the minor characters in each scene, the backgrounds, the frames between each scene. As you can see, there's both actual architectural framing and illusionistic architectural framing with the pilasters in each and every scene. You can bet that Masaccio, though, would be in charge of the main characters, Christ first and foremost among them, but also major players like St. Peter, the kind of de facto head of the 12 disciples. So this is definitely a great scene that I've chosen. I wanted to show you, pictures one from the Brancacci Chapel to kind of reduce it down to a single composition for us to really analyze formally. It is also a great example of how Masaccio is a master of humanist art, in that he makes his art more naturalistic and more classical in that way, in very specific manners shown here in Tribute Money. The story, the subject matter, is a moment during Christ's, I should say Jesus's ministry before he is crucified. So this is the man, the mortal on earth with his disciples. And they've just come from the Sea of Galilee, and they've come off the boat where a member of the community is essentially asking for a fee, a tax, to dock their boat there and to step off into the community. And at first, you can see on the far left, St. Peter might look a little agitated to you, and he's the one that is often very loud about people demanding too many things from his teacher, his rabbi, as he would have addressed Jesus at the time. And yet, Jesus very calmly tells him to go to the shore, and there will be a fish there with a coin in its mouth. It's one of Jesus's miracles that he performs throughout the 4 Gospels of the New Testament. So notice where I've begun. I've begun in the center, which makes enough sense. It is a Renaissance painting. And as Jesus and both St. Peter point, this is actually episode 2. This is St. Peter following Jesus's orders and finding the fish and grabbing the coin. Then we have to come around to episode 3, where we see St. Peter actually paying the tribute so that they can be on their way. The kind of sketchiness, the grayness of the background helps us focus. Note that everyone's in these bright colored robes and drapery, and that is on purpose to, again, draw our eye to what's happening in the foreground and kind of consider the background just a means of looking at these naturalistic bodies in 3D space. We have atmospheric perspective happening, where everything up close, the buildings, for instance, are very sharp, very bright, and the mountains in the far distance, especially to the left, get the lightest, the grayest, and the less distinct. We have linear perspective at work, where, remember, wherever you can see diagonals that are converging, that would in the real world be parallel lines, like the lines of the steps behind the tax collector there. That's when linear perspective is at work, to show particularly buildings, spaces that are man-made in illusionistic 3D. So perspective is definitely part of Masaccio's humanist toolkit. Of course, if the space is naturalistic, it's not going to really do much good if your bodies are not also naturalistic, right? So we have real massive weighted bodies here standing firmly on the ground. They're not floating as they can seem in many medieval examples. And they are very substantial in Masaccio's study of anatomy, even though he has covered them quite modestly, as these are all very holy men of the Bible. Jesus Christ, for instance, and the sainted disciples among them. Note there's also a difference between their garb and the tax collector, who's dressed very much more like a Quattrocento Italian gentleman would be, whereas we see definite Roman times in these draperies, right, that we're maybe used to seeing Jesus in. So the halos are a holdover of that medieval style, right? They're that kind of golden, very spiritual rather than realistic element. If we look, though, at the rest of the bodies, we can see shading or chiaroscuro used under chins, under feet, anywhere you see shadow. That is where the artist is considering a point of light source and how that light would hit the person's face and their body, how it would change how we view the colors of their robes to a darker red versus a lighter red, for instance, on Jesus there. And everybody is also casting a shadow, going from right to left. So we can say that over here is our light source. And so a right light source really kind of works against our narrative direction, right? We were coming from the center around to the right, and now we're going from right to left in terms of the realistic sunlight we can imagine peeking through the clouds and making the disciples cast these shadows. But taking a definite light source is, in the Quattrocento, one of the many humanist innovations, actually. So not only is foreshortening and chiaroscuro in Masaccio's toolkit, but a definite light source as well is part of what separates him and his work from previous painters. The last thing is a matter of composition, where in other examples, we might have the saints and Christ laid out individually where nobody's overlapping, so we can all essentially read who they are much more clearly. Masaccio groups his characters in very realistic ways, where obviously, if we're looking at this scene as if actors on a stage or as if we are there, we're going to see people with their backs turned to us. We're going to see people whose faces are just barely visible behind or between their compatriots. So who Masaccio places in the center here, for instance, and in the front is an obvious choice on the artist. So Jesus is going to have the least overlapping, right? Second is Peter. The tax collector does play an important role, but he's dressed differently and has his back turned to us. So all these little tiny choices of position and pose might seem a little random, especially when we consider we started in the center and went left and then right instead of just left, center, right, or right, center, left, the way we might read a book. But they're very calculated on the artist's part. They separate out what he would paint versus what an apprentice would paint, making the scene even easier to bring to life. And they also convince us that this is a realistic way that people would crowd around their leader, their teacher. This is a realistic way we might, as passersby, see the event unfold. So if you didn't catch those words, especially the Italian or Latin words, this is one of the Brancacci family chapel. And what we were just looking at there was how, as the our author Kleiner says, Masaccio makes his scriptural scenes living, real, and natural. So remember his toolkit. He has both types of perspective, and along with that, foreshortening, and chiaroscuro, which simply comes from the Italian for light and dark. So he's adding highlights to those parts that are in the light of that right light source, and he's darkening those parts that are to the left and shaded away from the right light source. Masaccio applies the same toolkit to this very skinny composition of Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden. But let me ask you, is this living, real, and natural to the same degree as tribute money? Maybe we could also bring up an Adam from chapter 20. This is Jan van Eyck's Adam, along with a choir of angels from the Ghent altarpiece. And here is his Eve from the other side of the open altarpiece. So when we're thinking of naturalistic, we might be tempted to say, well, that particular part there is not so realistic. For instance, perhaps Eve's proportions might be a little off-putting in Jan van Eyck's example. And in the same way, Adam's proportions in Masaccio's on the right-hand side might be a little strange, especially when we look at the curve of the back. And this part of the leg has always done it for me, where perhaps the chiaroscuro is laid on a little too thickly, or the line of the calf to the ankle is not quite as studied as well as it could have been. Another factor here is restoration and just the age of the fresco. This part here where you see the darker blue and kind of a jagged puzzle piece, that is a sign of how fresco is made. So definitely take a look at the video I have up on Blackboard in week 3 about the frescoes, because the entire chapel isn't done in one setting. There are certain sections even of each scene that would take a day to complete. So they're called giornata because giorno, the Italian for day, they are what can be completed in one day. That is the layering of plaster, eventually to the topmost layer where the pigment is added directly to the wet plaster before it dries. So that would be done in particular sections, and not necessarily nice, neat little square sections, but ones that are a bit jagged like you see around Adam. So we have original fresco versus some restored fresco here, affecting color and perhaps even affecting the living, real, and natural look of the original artist's scene. That is not to say, though, that there's nothing expressive and true going on. In Jan van Eyck's example, we have very naturalistic skin tone, but they stand and they act in the larger composition as statues, right? Eve holds her apple, they both hold the fig leaves that identify them and a part of the story. After Eve bites the apple and convinces Adam to do so, as some of the interpretations go, one of the bits of knowledge they inherit is the knowledge of their nakedness. They were fine with it before, but then all of a sudden they feel the need to cover themselves up with fig leaves. But that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is God the Father finding out that they have tasted the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He warned them. And so Masaccio shows us the beginning of their punishment. They are expelled by an angel bearing a sword there. And you can even see these rather dramatic lines shifting out from that gate on the left-hand side here. So we see essentially the walled area of the Garden of Eden in that little sliver of the composition, almost as if it is the voice of God or the Holy Spirit himself that they are reacting to, along with the threat of the angel and the sword. And unlike Jan van Eyck's Adam and Eve, they care a little less about covering themselves. There's no fig leaves. And Eve does cover herself. But look at Adam, face buried in his hands. He is crying, he's sobbing, he is grieving the loss of his home. So we have a very emotional response here, a very humanist response to the situation, to the story, that we don't get from the Jan van Eyck version. Masaccio brings it to life just like he did with the rest of his toolkit, through emotion and expression. As unrealistic as their forms, their bodies can seem for an artist who would have the opportunity to study anatomy, the look, kind of the ghostly look on Eve's face, the weeping of Adam, all of it enhances this idea of the toll the original sin, as it's called, has on both Adam and Eve and humanity, because it's that original sin that makes the idea of salvation necessary, that makes Christ's sacrifice necessary in Christian theology. So as small a piece of the chapel as this is, it was a very important piece for the Brancacci. Let's bring up Jan van Eyck again with his Adoration of the Lamb and see that where an artist uses a very strict composition with central alignment, as Jan van Eyck did, centering from the dove of the Holy Spirit through the Lamb representing Christ to the fountain, and in the real church, San Bavo, the Eucharist below on the altar. Masaccio doesn't seem to be as preoccupied with centering, does he? Even though he does in other elements, in other scenes like the Holy Trinity. We can see an artist who's looking at parts of the story, parts of scripture, and noting, does this need to be very diagrammatic and a sort of a teaching painting? Or does this need to be more conversational and natural? Rather like one of Jesus's parables, if you're at all familiar. A parable is a type of story that is taught as an allegory with a lesson at the end. Rather like Aesop's fables, the tortoise and the hare, for instance. In the end, it's not about the tortoise or the hare. It's about how slow and steady wins the race, right? And that's how Jesus' parables to both his disciples and the people around Galilee that he would speak to, that's how they would go and how he would teach. He would relate the topic to them instead of being very strict and diagrammatic. So we're looking at two different Renaissance modes here. Neither one is necessarily more Renaissance or more humanist than the other, but we have something that is more diagrammatic or didactic, as in it's for teaching, and one that is much more relatable, conversational. Now, in a place of teaching, like a monastery, you can imagine we're going to get a lot of the former rather than the latter, the didactic rather than the relatable. So Fra Angelico's composition might seem very stark, And it's meant to get across a very complicated idea in the matter of the time it takes for a monk to read the Latin inscription down here. Essentially what it says is, say a Hail Mary, lest you forget to pay your respects as you pass by this image of Mary. That's a poor paraphrase, but in this Annunciation scene, we have less richness, we have less going on in the interior, we don't have a lot of symbols to read. It's very simple. So those of you who are interested in going into design, for instance, this is what visual communication through design is about. You have a message that you want to send in the least complicated way. You want it to be fully communicated to the viewer. And you don't necessarily want the viewer to have to work for it. So this combination of image and text is definitely more of a designer's and a didactic mode of presenting the Annunciation than the ones we've seen before. Fra Angelico does put perspective to good use. Remember, we're looking for diagonal lines. So here we have the converging not only of the floor, but the ceiling as well. We can kind of draw a line across these lovely, realistically shaded arches in the vaulted ceiling of the place where Mary is seated. And I say that because it's very nondescript, right? We can't necessarily say, is this, her home? Is it the front porch of her home? Probably not with Corinthian columns. No, those are very Brunelleschi columns right there. So this is Fra Angelico, the painter influenced by the architect. Note 2, anyone have any issues with that lawn? The green grass and leaves and flowers that look a bit more like a carpet than real lush vegetation, and the background too that has a flatness to it. That is because it is definitely not secondary but tertiary in terms of importance. We have Mary and Gabriel, which are primary, the architectural framing, secondary. The greenness is a lovely break for our eyes, right? And it also helps us, even those red lines I've left here, help us go from left to right, focus in, quite literally funneling us in to the main event, which is Gabriel bowing, genuflecting here. He is paying homage to Mary. They're, in essence, greeting, bowing to each other. This is the moment before the news is delivered. So, a couple things about what makes an artist like Fra Angelico choose this mode. This is in the refectory, or essentially the very private living spaces where they would live and eat with each other and not necessarily take public guests of a monastery. And depending upon the order even, that would affect how they approach art. A very strict Benedictine approach might call for example, such a stark design. And naturally, the monks are going to be very aware of praying, bowing at certain times, depending on where they are in the monastery and depending on what they're looking at. For instance, if they're in the church, they would walk a few paces and bow to the altar, if you've maybe seen people do that in real life or on television. So the beware lest you omit to say a Hail Mary, which I think is a much more poetic paraphrase in English, is not a sign that they would necessarily need that warning, but it is there definitely for maybe the younger monks. So this is a clear linear form. You can see basically where Fra Angelico would have used his cartoon, his drawings in charcoal to set the line of each and every giornata of this fresco. And that also helps in terms of kind of clearing the way for expression. If it were busy with symbols and busy with silks and copper pots and lilies like we've seen before, the expression of, beware lest you omit to say a Hail Mary, the expression of mutual respect between Gabriel and Mary might be lost. So when it seems like there's an absence of maybe visual expression, that's when we need to look for something that is a bit more didactic or teaching. In this case, it is a very spiritual, theological idea of you're in the presence of a Mary who is just figuring out who she is in the grand scheme of things, and that she will be the mother of the Messiah. If you caught my references, I'm comparing Fra Angelico's Annunciation to Robert Campion's Annunciation from the Marotta altarpiece. And you can see a definite difference, not only in the level of detail and the crowding up of the composition with symbols and icons, but also the difference in perspective, where Fra Angelico is definitely paying attention to Brunelleschi and Ghiberti. Robert Campion is approaching perspective in a bit more of a secondary way. It's not primary for him. What is primary is the reading of each and every object in the piece that corresponds, says something about Mary, down to single candles and even the decoration of the glasswork in the windows. Say something about her purity, her piety, her worthiness of being the mother of God, essentially. Fra Angelico doesn't need to do that, definitely for an audience of monks, but he is showing an essence of respect, a reminder of scripture in a designer's simplest way possible. We'll look again at some past examples on the left from the Trecento. This is Ambrogio Lorenzetti. And the use of arches is not new, although remember, these are very Brunelleschi arches. But Fra Angelico could also be influenced by past painters like this, who essentially used the real, very real frame of an altarpiece and used them as walls and columns and arches. So right here, this is realistic wood frame, and yet the vault in there, that is illusionistically painted in perspective. So we believe that Saint Anne is reclining in a realistic Renaissance room as she's just given birth to Mary, the lady we see on the right, being informed about her own child. So influenced by these altarpieces that use architectural conceits, the idea that the line between each panel of a triptych is the line between a room, is a wall in a building, is something that Fra Angelico would be interested in. And he would use to frame Mary by herself under one arch and Gabriel in his own arch as he is just landed from the outside. Of course, not all Renaissance artists are painting Mary 24/7. It is a favorite subject among both patrons and artists, to be sure, especially in Italy. Yet the humanists, remember, they're reading other authors. They're reading other books besides the Bible. So from the works of Aristotle, from the poetry of Virgil and Ovid, they would get not only philosophy and history, but they would also get the mythology of the Greco-Roman world, essentially the gods and goddesses that people like Ovid and Virgil worshipped. So this is a great example of a secular humanist composition, done again for the great families of Florence. This is Sandro Botticelli, who is employed many times by the Medici family. And his particular scene here, the birth of Venus, comes from a contemporary Renaissance poem. So we have a couple layers of humanist study here. Somebody studying perhaps the mythology set down by the Greek Hesiod, and learning, commenting, writing their own poetry based on that ancient information. So Sandro Botticelli gets the story third hand almost by the time it gets to him ready for painting, reading a poem as opposed to the primary source Hesiod from the actual Greek world. Venus is goddess of love. She's also known in Greek as Aphrodite. And the myth of her birth, and just as an aside, if you haven't studied mythology, if you haven't studied classical, that is Greek and Roman mythology specifically, when I use the term myth, I'm not saying it's false. Myth comes from a Greek term that simply means story, just as logic comes from the Greek logos, that just means word. So for us, the mythos is a story that often explains kind of the greater parts of life and humanity. So love, as personified by Venus, is borne along and is born among sea foam. Hence, we are on the shore of her sacred island, and we see the little waves kind of pushing her along. Not big, threatening waves, but very gentle waves here. Venus is also associated with a type of birth or a type of conception that is, for lack of a better term, without a mother. Where we saw Saint Anne, who gives birth to Mary, who gives birth to Jesus. Unlike some other gods and goddesses, Aphrodite didn't strictly have a mother. She is the daughter of Zeus, and Zeus alone. Jupiter, if we're talking Latin, and Venus. The idea of being borne along by sea foam is actually quite biological. That, we could connect it even to the greater idea of evolution, how living organisms first started in this kind of primordial soup in the sea, and then eventually crawled out to land. See how mythos, the myth, even today it is relevant because it can be used, applied to a very modern idea, like the very fossil record that goes back, 4 billion years. Back to the ancient mythos, though. She's borne along gently by the breeze, personified here. This is the west wind, the zephyr. And Pomona, her servant, a nymph, comes in to greet her and robe her, as she is essentially a queen or a lady, and Pomona is a lady's maid. These personifications you see are all centered around, left and right, the main event. And yet she, like David, if you remember the sculpture part, is in contrapposto. She has this very kind of relaxed side and then a taut, bent side to her. That shows us not only in subject matter, but in study of anatomy and the construction of the very form on his canvas. Botticelli is interested in the Greeks and the Romans. He is a humanist himself, working for humanist patrons. So I choose The Birth of Venus still, even though, as you might read, Primavera has a little bit more to sink your teeth into, particularly in terms of the meeting of humanism and Catholicism. Yet Botticelli also leads us, with his 1480s work there, to Savonarola. In late Quattrocento Florence, Savonarola here, which I'm not able to yet credit this particular portrait. He's done in a very strict, very Roman profile, all in black. He is a monk, he's a clergyman who is opposed to humanist culture. He would abhor the statue of David crafted by Donatello for the Medici. He disliked the Medici specifically for the way they were leading Florence. And after the death of Lorenzo, the leader of the family, he essentially has absolute control of the city-state. And his control leads to book burning, banishment of the rest of the Medici clan, and not only books, but anything that professes vanity, anything that professes an interest in the pagan world of the ancient Greeks and Romans. So ladies would give up their fine fabrics and furs. They would give up their drawings and prints of Venus and the other gods. They would give up their poetry in the hope of being worthy of heaven. So again, we have that very Garden of Eden-like threat that you've strayed a little too far with all of your reading of Virgil and Aristotle and your nude statues of David. Too far, Savonarola says. And he has quite an effect on Botticelli particularly. On the right, Birth of Venus. On the left, a later crucifixion scene by Botticelli. And in terms of personal style, that is personal manner in the way he paints, do you see a relationship? Now, part of it is a difference in subject, but the other part is Botticelli has changed. He's influenced by the monk Savonarola. And also, think of that type of situation. Book burning, it's the setting of witch hunts in Salem. It's the setting of pogroms and the rounding up and violence against Jews in 1930s Germany. So do you resist or do you collaborate? That is Botticelli's choice here. So yes, his later painting gets a little more dark, a little more focused on a didactic form of painting, both in terms of the color and the composition, and in the inclusion of, again, God the Father, the dove of the Holy Spirit, and Jesus himself. This is the type of print, an engraving by Antonio del Pollaiuolo. Say that 3 times fast. This is the type of print that would be given to the fires of Savonarola, because it would be indecent, unchristian in the monk's eyes. Not every monk's, but certainly his. The other part of it is, unlike Botticelli, he has no necessarily literary resource for this. It's not a particular battle from mythology. And unlike Masaccio, of course, he's not using scripture and acting out a story from the Bible. On top of that, do you really think people would fight each other with arrows and swords and axes without any armor, let alone clothing? the whole thing is a celebration, a study of the human body. The part of humanism that I think comes in most conflict with religion, that is Catholicism at the time, is this interest in the human body. Because for many centuries, the Catholic religion, the Catholic Church, has taught a disinterest of the human body and a focus on the soul. So at best, this is a distraction. At worst, in Savonarola's eyes, it is terrible, terrible pagan blasphemy. But for Poleiwolo, it's a lovely example for us to see of an artist not only imagining how bodies would look in these very complicated poses, but imagining and probably with cadavers figuring out how the musculature looks beneath the skin. So he and later artists like Leonardo and Michelangelo, it wouldn't quite be proper to perform an autopsy. It's something that's just simply not done unless the church grants permission. So he could get permission from his local parish, or in the dead of night, he could sneak in with a grave robber and study the human body. Take a look again on Blackboard for a source on that. Figuring out just how the arm would look as it is raised with a sword, or as it knocks an arrow to a bow. Just how the bodies would look as they struggle against each other in battle. This would inform scenes, paintings of real and fictional battles set for, the Medici and the great families of Europe. This could inform great scenes from the Iliad where the Greeks fight the Trojans, right? So it's not completely frivolous. It's not useless, Poleiwolo's study here. This is the foundation, quite literally, of all the art of the Renaissance. Anatomy and the act of drawing that we see here reproduced through engraving. Remember, engraving is when the artist begins with a drawing, but transfers it with a burin, basically scratching it into a copper plate that would then be inked. So this is the paper that has been pressed onto the plate. Everything that is black, it's not solid black. It's actually a very painstaking design of parallel hatches. Each line scratched in with that burin is a hatch. Parallel hatches are especially good at showing the topography of land, so the height of the mountains and the lows of the valleys, and the textures, in this case, of muscle. So we have kind of a forest of grapevines and trees in the background, meant to imply wilderness, right? We have a little bit of a nondescript location, just like Fra Angelico's Annunciation. The main part, the main event, of course, are the bodies in these various poses that he has prepared. In essence, it advertises him as a virtuoso of designing, drawing the human body. An engraving like this can be reproduced. It can be drawn onto larger cartoons that are then used for fresco. So it is literally, as well as figuratively, the basis for all of Renaissance art. A little close-up here of one of the more dramatic moments of the scene. The parallel hatching that we see, along with the contour lines of each battling man here, present the body as if without skin, or écorché. So this is a study of muscle, not how the drapery looks over the muscle. That comes next. And not even so much different faces, right? Don't they all look almost identical? They're just in different situations, different emotions, one winning, the other losing. We could look at this essentially as the same body, the same man, 10 times in 10 different poses. For contrast, bring up Schongauer's engraving here, who used a combination of parallel and cross-hatching. Because for Schongauer, the importance was not the texture itself, but the effect of the texture. What I mean by that is he's not studying the wings of the demon the way Antonio del Poleolo is studying the human body. We just need to believe and get the naturalism of these terrifying demons. So parallel hatching is good for the study and really the seeing of each rippling muscle. Cross hatches give us a greater sense of depth and richness. So it's not just a trick here with resolution. There is a difference in terms of the kind of surface quality of each of these engravings. To get us toward the end where we're looking out beyond Florence, we'll go to Rome first. So remember the Papal States, I go over the map in part 1, are centered on the city of Rome, where the Pope is headquartered. In the previous decades, there's been strife. If you remember me saying that, in fact, there were actually at one point 3 popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon, France, and a third one elected to solve the whole problem in total. In 1481 and 83, that's just a bad memory now. So this is the time of a pope ready to solidify and announce and advertise his power. So the Sistine Chapel, named after the Pope Sixtus, who had it built, uses very humanist design, for example, Roman triumphal arches, and the centralized Greek porticoed church here in the background. He uses perspective and light, the artist Perugino, a central composition, to basically create biblical propaganda. So this is one part theological, one part political. The Pope's authority in Roman Catholic tradition is based on the resurrected Christ giving Peter, Saint Peter, head of the disciples, the keys to heaven. And Perugino shows us in the front and center focus, very literally, that event, as if there are actual pearly gates that St. Peter unlocks for people to get into heaven. You can also think of this as a more philosophical, figurative idea of Christ giving Peter the means, right, to spread the word, spread the gospel. There's also the great verse, "On my rock I will build my church." Rock in Latin is Petrus, Peter. So calling this disciple Peter, the idea of foundation stones literally being used on which to build churches, build buildings. It's this lovely mixture of metaphor and scripture that is not strictly taken from the Bible itself. It's rather an interpretation. So the authority based on a biblical event, it's the very simplest way of thinking of it. This would be challenged in just a few decades with the Protestant Reformation. Let's look at the full view here. So on either side, to frame both the architecture and the scene, we have triumphal arches, many of which would have been still standing in Rome for Perugino to draw from and to study from. The church we see here, we're going to see similar designs by Leonardo himself of an octagonal centralized church, not unlike the Florence Baptistry. And again, arches that Brunelleschi would approve of. All of this is set in a wide city plaza or Italian piazza with the Roman hills in the background, as if it occurred in Italy, in Rome itself, in a place that is almost recognizable as St. Peter's Square, as a place that is almost recognizable as the Vatican itself. It has just enough realism to be seen as such. And St. Peter's Church, that we'll talk about in chapter 22, that place in Rome that becomes Vatican City in modern day, is the place of St. Peter's burial. So we have, again, many layers of foundation here. That the man, Peter, becomes first Bishop of Rome, and the Bishop of Rome is Pope. So each Pope elected after that is the successor of St. Peter, and in essence is given the keys to heaven in the same way we see depicted here. Note the mixture of drapery that is very convincingly biblical and clothing that is very Quattrocento. We have a mixture of saints, people with halos, Christ himself, of course, even saints in the background. You can see their halos as simply diagonal lines on their heads, almost like graduation caps. The whole crowd is populated by both spiritual people and very real Italian people that you would see in St. Peter's Square, that you would see among the officials of the Vatican and the wider Roman population itself. Because what the church needed to do at this point, after that great schism of dueling popes, is solidify their power, both religiously and politically. So the picture, the fresco here in the Sistine Chapel, down on the walls, so Michelangelo doesn't end up painting over it, don't worry about that. The image here serves two purposes: the political and the religious, the realistic and the very figural, metaphorical that is going on here. Remember, we had a taste of that pairing of realistic and metaphor with the idea of the donor portrait. And in Urbino, for Federico da Montefeltro, Piero della Francesca paints something we can call a sacra conversazione, or sacred or holy conversation. So this is where the donor portrait on the lower right-hand side, that's the Duke himself, Federico is shown in the same panel as the Virgin Mary. In past examples, the donor portraits have been in separate panels. So we all have a door or a wall or an arch between the earthly realm and the sacred realm. In this case, the two realms, the two beings, the spiritual being of the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus himself, and Federico da Montefeltro, are in conversation. No, they're not speaking, but they're in the same space. So the conversation is metaphorical. Urbino is a duchy. It is also under the power of the Pope. It's one of the papal states. So the Pope would have gathered allies that would be he'd be able to call them up in order to fight the duchies and republics that did not want him to be exerting taxes on them. Remember, a duchy is basically a monarchy. Federico rules Urbino just by himself. The difference would be in a republic like Florence, the Medici ruled along with great families like the Brancacci and the Pazzi, although they do end up fighting sometimes. So Piero gets these major commissions of religious devotion, but also secular propaganda. And here we can see Federico as a devoted knight. This is a holdover of the chivalry of the 100 Years' War, the idea of nobility being closer to God, being closer to the Virgin in this sense, and morally superior. So he's in his brightly shining armor, kneeling before the Holy Family with saints, of course, to accompany him with his patron saint, but also others that we can recognize, like St. John there on the left, almost as if the Virgin Mary holds court at Urbino instead of the Duke himself. I do want to draw your attention to both the setting, this architectural setting we can recognize from Masaccio, also from Sant'Andrea, designed by Alberti, and the coffered vault. But the scallop shell and the dangling egg here, those are, again, symbols of femininity, symbols of fertility and motherhood, hence why they are on the central axis with the Virgin herself. So it's, again, chivalrous. He's devoted not necessarily to the very masculine qualities of the Trinity, but to the feminine qualities of the Virgin Mary. And even in battle, chivalrous knights would shout that it's for Madonna, my lady, or in French, Notre Dame, hence why the churches are all called that. So Madonna is Federico's lady, the one to whom he devotes his power, his prestige. His other lady is Battista Sforza. And Piero paints this after Battista dies. So that is often given as an explanation for her paler skin. But often, and this is a very ancient idea, when we have both men and women in a composition, the women have paler skin and the men have darker skin. One is a sign of being outside on the battlefield in the sun. The other is a sign of gentility and domesticity, staying inside, out of the sun. And to be pale and to have that blonde hair and, yes, that hairline, that was the fashion in the Quattrocento. Even moving forward into the Cinquecento, even to England, where ladies would, in essence, shave their foreheads to have that hairline, the same as Queen Elizabeth's. Italian ladies would treat their hair with, well, the most common thing would be lemon juice to lighten it in the sun. And they would, if they couldn't keep their skin light, they would often cover it. Elizabeth was famous for covering hers with, among other things, lead powder. I do not recommend that. So we have a bit of Quattrocento fashion here, definitely. And the sweetest part, literally, is commemoration of Federico's wife. So this dual portrait, you know, these would work as donor portraits for an altarpiece, but yet they are facing each other. They are done together and out of sync with the tradition, because Piero is specifically pointing out the loss of his wife and the loss of his companion, who in essence ruled Urbino in his stead. She is not just mother, but also great lady, great leader. Piero uses Roman coins, like the one of Augustus or Tiberius, in choosing which type of portrait, a very Italian, very Roman profile here. And he chooses which side, because his duke, he knows, has a terrible scar on the right-hand side. So he shows his master, his employer, his patron in the best light. And especially for a military man that we just seen in armor, a very gentle, a very sweet, a very emotional, moving tribute that is actually has been reframed. So don't read too much into the gold frame, just the portraits here of Federico. Where is she? And Battista, with very heavily Flemish influence in the layers of color, in the receding landscape, even the quality of light on the water that Piero provides for us. Not all of his work, though, is easily explained. I'll put this up just in case anyone feels like doing a paper on Piero della Francesca. Art historians smarter than me don't even agree on the meaning of flagellation of Christ. You can see what we're seeing on the outside here. That is the wood panel on which this is painted. This is an image of it unframed. The flagellation of Christ is mentioned in the Gospels. So here is Christ, and there's Pontius Pilate. He is being whipped, tortured, as part of his punishment. The three men on this side of the composition are as yet unidentified, and that is what makes it so puzzling. On top of that, this is not a painting, a scene set in Jerusalem, as it ought to be. We have very Italian architecture in the background, trees in the background that could very well be real buildings in Urbino that influenced Piero. What we do have is a composition that is obviously influenced by Ghiberti and Brunelleschi, very strict linear perspective. The architecture frames the biblical and the more earthly figures. And if we were able to see a bird's eye view of this scene, we would essentially see a foursquare. So this is the roofed area where Jesus is. This is the open area where the three unidentified men are. And this is open space leading back to the trees and the buildings. And this is this open space here. So it is a very square mathematical composition. And that is the most rational thing about it, because nothing else quite suits the narrative of Masaccio or the very didactic or diagrammatic way that Piero himself set up his own Sacra Conversazione with Madonna and Federico. So I'll leave that to you if you're interested at all to try to puzzle that one out. And in case you've forgotten, this is what I'm looking at, Isaac and his sons, as an example of what Piero might have been influenced by in terms of Ghiberti. A duke like Federico would also employ a painter to decorate the inside of his palace, not just his chapel to ensure his place in heaven, but where he eats and where he sleeps to ensure his enjoyment during life. And as you can see, the topic, the subject changes. In a grand ducal palace like this one at Mantua, the main events are scenes from family history that essentially set up the lineage of the great man that dwells within. So we have ancestors, real family members. If they're alive, they even sit for the artist to get a realistic portrait done in fresco. And in some cases, the artist, Andrea Mantegna here, can even play around with perspective and with public versus private. This is the ceiling of the Camera Picta. That is essentially Latin for painted chamber or painted room. The Camera Picta is also the Duke's bedroom. So it's also called the Chamber of the Spouses. So Ludovico Gonzaga, like Federico, would be bound to marry well, a Sforza or someone else from another powerful family. And that marriage contract is not valid until the wedding night, when husband and wife have sex. The difference between today's traditions and Renaissance traditions are that often for dukes, this was not completely private. So Ludovico would have proceeded under the watchful eyes of his priest, of ambassadors from his wife's family, as well as his own family, so that everybody could legally say, yes, this contract is valid between the two realms, between Mantua and their allies. So the room itself is a political machine for political uses, not just for sleeping and not just for making the next generation of Gonzagas. It is also propaganda in its richness, in its opulence. These images of real court life, not just the watchful eyes of courtiers on your wedding night, but the watchful eyes of courtiers everywhere. You were always under scrutiny if you were a noble leader. Would have been a sign of how much of a focal point Ludovico is, as if the world revolves around him. So we have various Italian people and Moorish people, that is to say, from Africa, Northern Africa specifically, looking down, and we have very imaginatively cherubs, or in Italian, putti, little winged angels playing around, which could be interpreted as angel, cherub, or as Cupid. And Cupid, the god of love, certainly would be appropriate for the ceiling of a marital chamber, no? The best part about this is the illusion, where we have not only these wonderful views of the tiny chubby thighs of each little putti, but these great moments like one who's gotten his head stuck in the stone railing, and a couple more who seem to be having the same issue. We have a peacock here that would have strode the grounds at Mantua as a living, breathing, walking, chirping work of art. But even parts like this, where we have the barrel just over the edge, about to tip over, that is an illusion so involved it has its own name, di sotto in su. So basically it means from below upward. So our perspective, our viewing point is below, looking upward, quite literally, but in Italian for you to puzzle out there. The whole thing is trompe l'oeil. I'm switching languages on you. That's French for fools the eye. An oculus, if it's real, is a circular window, often at the top of a dome. So here we have a circular window. You might even call it an open roof at that size, but is not really there. It's providing the illusion that the room is open to the air. So the oculus is not real, but trompe-l'oeil. It fools us quite literally. And more specifically, it is de soto in su. So we are positioned beneath it literally, but also illusionistically, as if we can look up through it. And this unifies the space where everything around the walls of the camera picta are essentially made to frame this ultimate series of concentric circles that are the centerpiece of the entire room. Now, what I think Mantegna's masterwork has nothing to do with Ludovico. It is foreshortened Christ. And not because of the foreshortening, even though it is in the title. I think the genius of Mantegna here is the halo. And yes, Christ has a halo. Do you see it? In essence, he distorted the foreshortening. So his legs appear too short, the torso appears too big perhaps, the feet too small, because in true foreshortening, these feet ought to be much, much bigger to give us a sense of true proportion and scale. Mantegna has chosen to do that. He hasn't gotten it wrong. He chose to do that so that our eyes would go up here to the faintest of glinting gold halos. It is, again, a holdover of the past medieval form, medieval style of presenting a painting of Christ, mixed with the very humanist study of anatomy, down to the very texture of each wound from the crucifixion. Now, one wound that we don't quite see up here, you can just barely see it, that is the final wound, the spear wound that actually kills Jesus, as the story goes, I should say, as tradition goes. Unlike any other portrayal that we've seen before, this is made so our perspective, our viewpoint as people who look at this, we're not only given a picture window that is illusionistic, as if we could reach in and touch the table, but look at the shadow under the heels and the edge of the table here. It's as if he is going to fall out to us, as if we are meant to grab him. And that just enhances the naturalism, enhances the trompe-l'oeil, enhances the illusion that the viewer is in the presence of the divine. So among any other altarpiece that I've shown you so far, this one is perhaps the most convincing in giving a sense of the body of Christ literally present. Notice how the mourners, we can imagine Mary, St. John, Joseph of Arimathea is often present in crucifixion scenes as well. They're not done so that we can necessarily name them. We have someone who appears like a mother, so we could name her Mary, but the others are all cropped and foreshortened in such a way. Their identification is not part of it. It's no longer that diagrammatic mode of Masaccio's Trinity, or even of the artist that Masaccio most likely looked to for influence on the Brancacci Chapel, Giotto, in his lamentation scene, where we are bystanders. We are not one of the mourners. The body of Jesus is parallel to us instead of perpendicular. So the whole scene is again played out as if we're watching actors on a stage. Mantegna doesn't give us actors on a stage. Mantegna includes us, the viewer. So for a devoted Catholic, this would be a very powerful composition. And that is, in design terms, the wanted, needed effect. So again, remember the toolkit. How does humanism translate into painting and fresco? And look at how sometimes they don't use the toolkit for very important reasons, like Mantegna does. And think about these families and patrons like Ludovico, the Brancacci, the Pope, and how they patronize arts during the Renaissance. They don't just do it because it's the right thing to do, because they like it. It's often also politically necessary. And for the Pope, it is religiously necessary too. So do we still have these important political or other families patronizing the arts for those reasons, political or not? Do we have the same idea of patronage and donors? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. Again, all ideas for a future research paper.